Well, in Australia, we are commemorating Anzac Day this week. Anzac, ANZAC, Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. It was an acronym that was coined in World War One in the battles of Gallipoli, and it was due to Australian and New Zealand servicemen sharing one particular part of the front. um, the entire region was called Anzac Cove. The Turks kindly renamed it Anzac Cove. And it is a special week in Australia. Now, Anzac Day ceremonies were first birthed in 1916. So the war was still going on. Men that had served in Gallipoli were still serving in France and in Africa and the Middle East. And people wanted to commemorate the fact that these soldiers had died for their country far, far away. It was somewhat spontaneous, it was small, and it was uniquely Australian. They weren't commemorating the empire or the king or anything like that. It was about the soldiers. And that is what's going on this week in Australia. I want to talk about why Anzac Day is so personal to me, why it is so special. And I also want to contrast that with why the hell we are not doing more to support the veterans who served in the Middle East in the last couple of decades. Why are so many veterans taking their own lives? That's what I want to talk about today on STP. Let's go. We'll see how it goes. Welcome to Shattered the Podcast. STP is the story of my journey from the depths of mental illness to a place where I could live again. Alrighty. I come from a military family. My mum met my dad while they were serving in the army together. My dad's dad and his dad all served in the Australian Army. My brother served in the Australian Army. My maternal grandfather and, of course, my mum, who I've mentioned, all served in the Australian Army. None of those people are commemorated on the walls of remembrance at the Australian War Memorial because they all came back alive. And to be honest, I'm glad. I've seen people visiting those names on the wall of remembrance, and I know how hard it is. So it's with a very solemn and quiet pride that I think about Anzac Day, particularly Anzac Day for us. Now, I said 4 generations of fathers and sons. My brother, my dad, my grandfather, my great-grandfather all served in the Australian Army, either in the AIF, World War One, World War Two, Vietnam, or the Middle East. I never served in the military. I would have lasted about 5 minutes. My parents were adamant that I not try and go in the army. I couldn't have dealt with the discipline. But that doesn't mean that I haven't had a fascination, a desire to learn as much as I could about Australia's military history. Growing up on army bases, you just learn to love being around the military and learning about what our soldiers did and didn't do is of great interest to me. Now, my family's connection to Australia's military history is not what you would call significant. There's no medals. For valor. There's no, as I said, names on the wall of remembrance. There's no newspaper articles. There's no famous photos that they appear in. They all served quietly. They did their job for as long as they were asked, and then they came home. I think that there's a solemn pride in that. But together with that pride, since my brother has returned from Afghanistan after his like third or fourth time there, his life and his mind, his sanity was forever altered by that service. His struggles since returning home have been extreme. People's lack of understanding, his lack of understanding, the stigma attached to having a mental illness, the comparisons, comparing himself to diggers that, did exactly the same job as him, but were hurt in the line of duty. The digger that got blown up in his Bushmaster 3 times and still went out driving the vehicle. Now, my brother compares himself to this guy and just says, that guy's a hero. Now, my brother drove the same streets in the same places, almost at the same times. The difference was he was lucky. Now, he was supposed to be there fixing radios. So we thought that he would be spending a lot of time at base. But the problem is, when radios break down in the military, they don't break down in the base. They break down out in the field and they break down out in the fire bases. Now, I don't know exactly how much time he spent outside the wire, but I know that it was significant. He devalues his service by saying, look, I just went to fix radios. When I was fixing radios out in the field, it was up to other guys to protect me. But can you imagine being in a war zone where bullets could come at you at any moment and you're holding a screwdriver and a wrench, not a rifle? I can't even imagine the stress that would put on a person's mind. What are you going to do? Stab them? Bolt them to death? Watching my brother struggle, and I can say thankfully that he is still alive, but he could have been one of the 1,200 veterans that have taken their lives in recent years. 1,200. We lost 500 odd into the Vietnam War. We lost 42 in Afghanistan. We've lost over 1,200 veterans. 1,200 veterans have taken their lives. One would be too many. So that's the problem. You may be like me. I don't know what it's like to serve in the military. I don't know what it's like to feel the absence and the pain of homecoming, the lack of understanding. I can guess. And, mental illness is no picnic. But I found that there's a few things that I can do as a civilian that can help our veterans. Now, I'm not a government department. I'm not a charity organization. I don't have qualifications. I can't get out there and fix a veteran. What I can do is care. Now, how do you show that you care? How do you show a veteran that their service was important to you? One of the best, first, and most simple things that we can do is to ask them about their service. Now, of course, some people are nervous about, I can't ask them. I don't want to trigger them. The fact of the matter is that not every second of a serviceman or woman's life was harrowing. There were times where it was downright boring. There was times when it was lonely. And if my brother is anyone to go by, there were times that were incredibly funny. Now, I knew that my grandfather served in Vietnam. I also knew that my family did not talk to him about it. They didn't ask him, they just decided. And no blame on anyone. This is going back to the Vietnam War. Nobody knew what mental illness was really. But nobody talked to my grandfather, and I knew that I was not allowed to talk to him about it. Until one day I did. Just ask the question. What'd you do before you joined the army? Then where did you join? Why did you join the army? All topics that allowed him to tell me his story his way. We were watching a documentary once on the Battle of Long Tan, and my grandfather was with the artillery units on that day. It's an incredible movie, Long Tan. Look it up, watch it. My pop was one of the dudes that was an artilleryman. Now, on the day, he was tasked with getting soldiers to defend where they thought the Viet Cong were coming from and the NVA were coming from. And it was a harrowing day for him. The night before, there'd been a mortar attack. And in the morning, he had found an unexploded mortar between his hooch and the tent of the guy next to him. If that had have gone off, I wouldn't exist. He knows that he would have been killed. There was a documentary that came out about the battle, and I asked to watch it with him. And it was amazing because he was telling me all these stories of, oh, this is what I was doing at this point. Now, that stuff didn't come out of me just going, hey, Pop, how bad was Long Tan? Tell me about it. It came from a discussion around what he was willing to tell me. It is an easy thing to talk to a veteran because there's so many parts of their service that you can talk about. Now, you may have a veteran that I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it. And that's fine. But at least they've told you. At least you know, you're not supposing. You're not thinking that, oh, I can't because if you can't talk to them because they've asked you not to, then that's a completely different story. Are out there to help veterans and are willing to connect with a veteran. You can contact them, say, I've got a veteran, they're struggling. What can I do? And that's great. And those organizations are important, incredibly important. But we, as the people that love these veterans, can play our part in that healing. Now, the end of the story of watching the documentary with my grandfather about Long Tan is the fact that my grandmother, my nan, came in right at the end and she just sat there, and it must have been frustrating for her because I was this was in the days before you could pause this stuff. I was asking question after question, and it was, we could barely hear what was going on the television, and I was taking note of things, and I was asking questions, and later on we're having lunch, and my nan um, turned to my pop and said, I have never heard you talk about Vietnam ever. Never once in their married life, and they were married like 50 years, had she heard him talk about his time in Vietnam. She said, why are you telling Mark all this? And what he said was so telling. He just said, Mark asked. He wants to know, and I want to tell him. Now, this could have been, you know, uh, because it had been so long after the war. But that answer made me so sad that all these people desperately wanted to know what he'd done in the war. All these family members, they wanted to celebrate whatever it was that he did, but they didn't know because they didn't ask. You've got a veteran in your life. You may know a veteran. You may have a friend that served. You may be walking around on tenterhooks because you're concerned that you don't want to upset them. But how do you know unless you ask? I don't know what sphere of influence you may have. I don't know who you can impact in your decisions, your choices. But we need to be doing more for our veterans. Even the ones that are getting help are not getting enough help. We as a nation need to do better for our veterans. If you are a veteran, in all sincerity, thank you so much for what you've suffered through, for what you've given up. The families of veterans know how much you gave up. You are important. And if you are struggling, please stay another day. Find someone to talk to. I beg you, please find someone to talk to. I want to thank you for listening to the podcast this week. If you can, spare a moment for servicemen and women, those that didn't come home and those that suffer, even though they did come home. Have a great week, everyone. I'll talk to you soon. Bye for now. Hey, thanks for joining us on Shattered the Podcast. I'm Mark. Special thanks to my producer, Meredith Brosnan, and also to Torian, Kevin, and Lorraine. And we can't forget the amazing band Adelaide, who let us use their song as our theme. For more information, check us out on all your socials, STP Shattered the Podcast.